The Yuan dynasty is often described in one quick phrase. It was the Mongol dynasty that ruled China. That phrase is true, but it is far too small for what really happened. The Yuan was not simply a foreign regime sitting on Chinese soil. It was the moment when the largest conquest empire on earth tried to turn battlefield victory into lasting rule over one of the most complex civilizations in Asia. The central question was never whether the Mongols could conquer China. They already had the power to do that. The deeper question was whether they could rule it in a way that would last. A steppe empire could break armies with mobility, discipline, and terror. But governing a densely populated agrarian world required taxes, records, roads, grain transport, and political legitimacy. Victory alone was not enough. That is why the Yuan story is not only about conquest. It is about the limits of conquest. It shows how military brilliance could build an empire, and how structural tension could keep that empire from becoming fully secure. Under the Yuan, China was drawn into a wider imperial world than before. Trade moved more widely. People traveled farther. The northern capital gained a new weight that would outlast the dynasty itself. Yet power is not the same thing as durability. A dynasty can be enormous and still be brittle. The Yuan would prove exactly that. This is the story of a dynasty that ruled China. It is also the story of why ruling China was harder than conquering it. The roots of the Yuan dynasty lie far from the rice fields and river cities of China. They begin on the steppe, among mounted peoples whose political world was built around alliance, mobility, and war. In 1206, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan. That moment did more than unite Mongol tribes. It created a war machine that would reshape Eurasia. Mongol warfare moved fast, struck hard, and adapted quickly. Cavalry, discipline, intelligence gathering, and psychological shock made their armies unusually effective against larger, settled states. Northern China felt that pressure early. The Jin dynasty faced repeated attacks, and in 1215 the Mongols captured Dadu near present-day Beijing. The northern gateway had been broken. Yet China was not a single political bloc waiting to be taken. The north and south were divided. The Jin ruled one world. The southern Song ruled another. That mattered because conquering China meant more than winning battles. It meant absorbing rival tax systems, rival elites, rival military traditions, and rival claims to order. In the Mongol world, conquest generated legitimacy. In the Chinese political world, legitimacy also required governance. A ruler had to feed armies, regulate grain, appoint officials, and claim the mandate to rule under heaven. The future Yuan dynasty emerged exactly at that intersection. It would try to join the logic of the steppe with the logic of the agrarian empire. It would never do so completely. That incompleteness is the key to the whole story. The Yuan would be strongest when conquest and governance still moved together. It would weaken when they pulled apart. The figure who made that experiment possible was Kublai Khan. He was a grandson of Genghis Khan, but he was more than a conqueror. He understood that ruling China required a new political language. When he emerged as Great Khan in 1260, he faced a strategic problem. The Mongols had enormous military power, but military power alone could not hold so much territory together. Kublai did not abandon the Mongol imperial tradition, but he did something decisive. He moved closer to the Chinese world he meant to govern. He shifted the political center away from Karakoram and toward Chengdu, and then Dadu. That was not just a geographic adjustment. It was a statement about where imperial gravity would now sit. In 1271, he proclaimed the dynastic name Great Yuan. That act mattered because names in imperial politics were not cosmetic. A dynastic title announced a claim to lawful rule. The Yuan name told Chinese subjects that this was no longer just an occupying military force. It was a dynasty. It intended to stand inside the line of imperial succession, not outside it. But that move created a tension that never disappeared. To rule China, Kublai had to speak the language of Chinese Empire. To preserve Mongol supremacy, he could not become fully Chinese in political terms. From the start, the Yuan was therefore both continuity and rupture. It inherited the form of a Chinese dynasty. It retained the instincts of a conquest empire. That dual identity made the dynasty powerful. It also made it unstable. The same structure that allowed rapid domination would later complicate long-term integration. Naming the dynasty was only part of the job. The southern Song still ruled the rich south. Until it fell, Kublai's dynastic claim remained incomplete. The war against the Song was long and demanding. Southern China was rich, urbanized, and hard to reduce. Rivers, fleets, fortified cities, and deep resource networks gave the Song real staying power. The Mongols adapted. They used Chinese and other non-Mongol specialists, siege techniques, naval power, and administrative pressure. Conquest became a system, not just a charge across open ground. That adaptation matters because it reveals something basic about the Yuan state. It was not strong simply because the Mongols were fierce. It was strong because it could use other peoples, other skills, and other institutions in service of Mongol rule. In 1276, the Yuan captured the Song capital at Linnan. That was a decisive blow. But the dynasty was not yet finished. Resistance continued in the south, and the final end came only in 1279 at the Battle of Yamen. There, the last organized Song resistance collapsed. China was unified under one regime for the first time in centuries. This was one of Kublai's greatest achievements. He did not merely defeat a rival state. He brought northern and southern China under a single dynastic structure. Yet the victory carried a hidden burden. The more territory the Yuan absorbed, the more people it had to govern, feed, tax, and persuade. Expansion solved one problem and enlarged several others. After 1279, the Yuan was no longer a conquest state moving toward empire. It was empire. And empire is hardest not at the moment of victory, but in the long work that follows. One of the most lasting choices of the Yuan dynasty was geographic. It gave permanent political weight to the north. Its capital at Dadu would change the map of power in China. Earlier Chinese dynasties had often centered power farther south or west. Kublai's court pulled the imperial center toward what is now Beijing. That shift would outlive the Yuan itself. Dadu was not just a residence, it was a statement of rule. Its scale, order, and placement announced that the Mongol dynasty intended to govern from the northern hinge between China and Inner Asia. That placement mattered strategically. It kept the dynasty close to the steppe world from which Mongol power had come. It also anchored control over North China, the administrative core of the new regime. In a sense, Dadu embodied the Yuan project. It was a Chinese imperial capital shaped by a dynasty whose political imagination still stretched beyond China alone. That dual orientation gave the dynasty reach. It also made the dynasty feel different from earlier Chinese houses. The capital itself became part of the argument over what kind of dynasty the Yuan really was. The greatest test began after victory. Conquest had delivered China into Mongol hands. Administration would decide whether the dynasty could keep it. The Yuan court adopted many tools of Chinese statecraft. It used territorial administration, taxation, official paperwork, legal procedure, and fixed institutions of government. It had to. A dynasty ruling such a populous and cultivated land could not live forever by steppe custom alone. It needed ledgers, grain tallies, transport schedules, and men who could read local conditions. Yet adopting the machinery of Chinese rule did not mean surrendering Mongol dominance. The Yuan court wanted Chinese governance without fully yielding political trust to the Chinese elite. That distinction was crucial. It allowed the dynasty to govern while preserving the privileges of conquest. It also kept the rulers at a political distance from many of the people they governed. Here lay one of the dynasty's deepest contradictions. The Yuan could not rule China without borrowing Chinese institutions, but it feared becoming dependent on the social forces that had sustained those institutions before. Yuan society was not politically neutral. It was ordered by rank, privilege, and imperial preference. The dynasty did not hide the fact that some groups stood closer to power than others. Mongols stood at the top. Below them were groups often called Semu, people from Central and West Asia who served the empire in various capacities. Northern Chinese and Southern Chinese stood lower in the political order. This hierarchy was not a side detail. It was part of how the dynasty protected itself. Rule was easier to maintain when the conquered majority was divided and the conquerors controlled the top of the system. In the short term, that structure made sense from the viewpoint of power. In the long term, it carried a cost. It made broad identification with the dynasty harder to build. A dynasty can endure on fear for a while. It lasts longer when enough people believe that its order is normal, lawful, and worth preserving. The Yuan never fully reached that point. This does not mean the Yuan had no support, no loyal officials, or no practical success. It means the dynasty's social base was narrower than its territorial scale. That imbalance mattered. Few issues reveal Yuan political anxiety more clearly than the civil service examinations. In earlier dynasties, the examinations had helped tie educated elites to the state. The Yuan disrupted that relationship. The Mongol rulers did not trust the old scholar gentry in the way many Chinese dynasties had. They saw literati culture as useful in places, but politically independent and potentially resistant. For long stretches, the examinations were suspended. That did not eliminate administration, but it did weaken a traditional path through which educated Chinese elites entered official service. That choice protected Mongol political dominance. It also limited the dynasty's ability to fuse itself with the cultural and administrative expectations of the realm it ruled. In 1315, the examination system was restored. That was important. It signaled that the dynasty recognized the need for more stable ties with literati society. But restoration did not erase earlier distance. A bridge rebuilt late does not instantly produce trust. By then, the Yuan had already spent decades ruling with an incomplete political compact. The examination issue, therefore, was never only about recruitment. It was about whether the dynasty was willing to share moral and political language with the people whose world it claimed to govern. Despite its tensions, the Yuan state was not administratively weak in every sense. It developed large-scale mechanisms of control that could operate across distance. In some respects, it pushed imperial governance in new directions. The Yuan expanded the use of regional secretariats and provincial administration. That helped the court manage a vast realm through delegated structures rather than direct command from one center alone. This was a real administrative achievement. Empire on this scale could not be sustained by charisma or cavalry alone. It needed structures that could convert imperial intention into local action. At the same time, delegated governance introduces risk. Local implementation can drift. Provincial actors can accumulate influence. Corruption can grow where oversight thins. The Yuan was therefore both centralized and stretched. It could project command over vast space, but the very breadth of that command made control expensive and uneven. That pattern would repeat across the dynasty. The Yuan often solved problems through enlargement. Yet every enlargement created new administrative weight. One of the clearest strengths of the Yuan state was movement. The dynasty maintained roads, courier systems, relay stations, and transport networks across extraordinary distances. That mobility reflected a steppe inheritance. Mongol rulers understood the strategic value of rapid communication. In China, that instinct became part of imperial administration. Orders could move faster. Officials and goods could move more efficiently. The court could see more, know more, and react more quickly than a looser state might have managed. But transport systems are expensive. Roads must be maintained. Animals must be fed. Stations must be staffed. Efficiency itself has a cost. In prosperous years, such networks magnified power. In harder years, they became another drain on limited resources. The Yuan could move empire, but empire was heavy to move. A dynasty does not survive on decrees. It survives on grain. To rule from the north, the Yuan had to keep food, taxes, and supplies moving from productive regions to the capital. The Grand Canal mattered enormously here. It linked the agrarian wealth of the south to the political center in the north. Without such transport, northern imperial concentration would have been far harder to sustain. This reminds us that the Yuan was not merely an empire of horsemen. It depended on barges, storehouses, accountants, and hydraulic management. Steppe power had to learn river discipline. When logistics work, dynasties look natural. Markets fill, soldiers are fed, and capitals remain calm. When logistics fail, politics quickly turns fragile. The Yuan dynasty also stands out for its monetary policy. Paper money became a central instrument of rule. In theory, it offered flexibility, reach, and administrative coherence. For a large empire, paper currency had obvious attractions. It could circulate more easily than heavy metal coinage. It could support taxation, exchange, and state spending across broad territory. Yet, monetary tools are only as strong as the system behind them. If confidence falls, if fiscal pressure rises, if overissue grows, money can become a source of strain rather than stability. This too fits the larger Yuan pattern. The dynasty often favored large-scale solutions. Those solutions could be impressive. They could also become fragile if the underlying political order weakened. The Yuan dynasty was part of a wider Mongol world, and that changed the scale of connection around China. Roads across Inner Asia were never perfectly safe or simple, but under Mongol rule, they could become more usable than before. That mattered for trade, but also for information. Objects, techniques, religious ideas, and human experience moved across a wider imperial frame. China, under the Yuan, sat inside a more visibly connected Eurasia. Merchants benefited from the scale of Mongol rule. So did imperial authorities who could draw on people from many regions. Administrators, financiers, artisans, and travelers became part of the Yuan landscape. The dynasty, therefore, looked outward in ways some earlier Chinese regimes had not. It was not culturally borderless, but it was more open to trans-regional circulation than a simple conqueror stereotype would suggest. This openness contributed to the Yuan's prestige. Yet, prestige is not the same as social fusion. A dynasty can impress the wider world and still remain politically distant from much of the population it rules. Later memory of the Yuan was shaped in part by travelers' accounts. Marco Polo is the most famous example. Whether every detail in such narratives can be taken at face value is another question. What matters here is not one traveler alone. It is the fact that the Yuan world appeared unusually large, wealthy, and accessible in the imagination of people who encountered it from outside. That image tells us something real. The Yuan did project an imperial order that was impressive in scale and reach. But outside admiration should not be confused with internal stability. A dynasty may look strongest when viewed from afar. The closer we move to its internal structure, the more clearly we can see the tensions beneath its surface. The Yuan court was not culturally empty. It staged power through architecture, ceremony, patronage, and visible order. Prestige was part of rule. Ceremony does political work. It teaches hierarchy, dramatizes legitimacy, and makes the center visible. A great court can persuade as well as intimidate. Yet pageantry can only reinforce real authority. It cannot permanently replace it. When institutions weaken, display begins to look like compensation. This is why imperial prestige must be read carefully. Under the Yuan, splendor was real. It was also part of a broader struggle to make conquest look like rightful order. Religion under the Yuan was not organized around one single orthodoxy. The Mongol imperial tradition was comparatively open to multiple religious communities so long as they fit within imperial order. Buddhism remained important, especially in forms connected to Tibetan patronage. Islam also held a visible place, particularly through communities involved in administration, trade, and finance. This religious plurality reflected the broader Mongol style of empire. The court did not need every subject to believe the same thing. It needed them to obey the same power. That flexibility had advantages. It widened the pool of loyal service and eased trans-regional exchange. It also made the Yuan look less like a narrowly defined Chinese moral state than some earlier dynasties had tried to be. The Yuan period produced important cultural change, though not always in ways the dynasty intended. Political rupture often creates new artistic responses. Some Chinese literati withdrew from active service or approached the new regime with caution. That distance did not silence them. It encouraged forms of art and writing shaped by reflection, memory, and moral reserve. This is one of the paradoxes of the age. A conquest dynasty that kept political distance from much of the old elite still presided over a period of major cultural development. Power and culture do not always move in the same direction. Sometimes distance from the state becomes part of what gives cultural production its force. The Yuan era, therefore, should not be reduced to administrative or military history alone. It also transformed the interior life of Chinese elite culture. Kublai Khan did not think only in Chinese terms. He remained a ruler of wider Mongol horizons. That broader ambition shaped Yuan policy in ways that were sometimes costly. The invasions of Japan are the most famous example. They revealed both the scale of Yuan ambition and the practical limits of projecting power across sea and weather. Campaigns against Dai Viet, Java, and other regions told a similar story. The Yuan could threaten widely and sometimes strike effectively. It could not convert every demonstration of force into durable control. These ventures matter for two reasons. First, they remind us that the Yuan was not simply inward-looking. Second, they imposed costs on a dynasty that already had much to maintain at home. An empire stretched outward can look magnificent. It can also become overcommitted. In the Yuan case, glory and strain often traveled together. Dynastic history is not only about emperors and ministries. It is also about how rule feels in the lives of ordinary people. Under the Yuan, that experience was uneven. Some communities benefited from expanded commerce and imperial order. Others experienced extraction, hierarchy, and distance from power. Most lived somewhere between those poles. This matters because dynasties fall not only when elites quarrel, but when enough people decide the order above them no longer protects or represents them. Social endurance has political consequences. The Yuan had strength. It also had distance. As long as the first outweighed the second, the dynasty held. When the balance shifted, the consequences moved quickly. Kublai Khan died in 1294. That date marks more than the end of one reign. It marks the beginning of a harder question. Could the dynasty function without the force of its founding ruler? This is a common problem in imperial history. Founders can hold contradictions together by sheer authority. Their successors inherit the contradictions without inheriting the same personal weight. After Kublai, the Yuan did not collapse at once, but the political center became less stable, succession more difficult, and court faction more damaging. A dynasty can survive one weak ruler. It can survive several if institutions are strong enough. The Yuan's problem was that some of its institutions were effective, but not deeply trusted across the whole political community. That is a subtle but decisive distinction. The Yuan had machinery. It did not always have legitimacy deep enough to make the machinery self-sustaining. Over time, the dynasty's internal fractures grew more visible. Court politics became more contested. Influence shifted through personal networks, factional competition, and struggle around the throne. Corruption is often a symptom as much as a cause. It grows when systems are overstretched, when trust narrows, and when office becomes a route to protection rather than service. None of this was unique to the Yuan. Many dynasties faced corruption and faction. What made it dangerous here was the thinner margin of political integration beneath the surface. When trust is shallow, crisis travels faster. People do not need to love a dynasty for it to survive, but enough of them must believe that its continuation is better than its collapse. By the mid-14th century, the Yuan was finding that belief harder to maintain. Environmental hardship made matters worse. Floods, crop failures, and disorder in the 1330s and after put severe pressure on local life. For ordinary people, this was not abstract instability, it was hunger and loss. In Chinese political culture, natural disaster was never only natural. It could be read as a sign that the ruler had lost heaven's favor. Crisis, therefore, became moral as well as material. This mattered because the Yuan already faced a legitimacy problem. A Chinese dynasty under strain could still appeal to shared moral language. A conquest dynasty under strain had less room for failure. When crops fail and taxes remain, resentment hardens. When officials appear distant, resentment sharpens. When the dynasty already feels socially narrow, resentment becomes politically explosive. Out of that pressure emerged rebellion. The most important movement was the Red Turban Uprising. It drew strength from social distress, millenarian energy, and anti-Yuan resistance. Rebellions rarely begin from one cause alone. They grow where hardship, belief, anger, and opportunity converge. By the 1350s, that convergence was in place. The Red Turbans were dangerous not simply because they fought. They offered an alternative moral and political energy to a dynasty already losing confidence. This is when Yuan weakness became visible in a new way. The dynasty was no longer only struggling inside the court. It was being challenged across the realm. Not every rebellion creates a new dynasty. To destroy one order and build another, insurgency must become statecraft. In 14th century China, that transition would be made by Zhu Yuanzhang. Zhu did not inherit a stable system. He rose through conflict, alliance, discipline, and political consolidation. His success tells us as much about Yuan weakness as it does about his own ability. A dynasty falls when opponents gain strength.
It falls decisively when the regime can no longer convince enough people that it can still command the future.
By this stage, the Yuan was no longer the confident empire of Kublai's greatest years. It was a dynasty reacting to pressures it had not solved when it was stronger. In 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang's forces captured Dadu. The Yuan court fled north. In China proper, the dynasty had fallen. This was not the end of all Mongol power everywhere, but it was the end of the Yuan as the ruling dynasty of China. The Ming would now claim the center. Yet dynastic replacement is never just a military event. It is also a judgment about which system can still claim order. By 1368, the Yuan had lost that claim in the eyes of too many. Why then did the Yuan fall? The easy answer is bad rulers and rebellion. The better answer is structural strain revealed by crisis. The dynasty carried from birth a tension between conquest identity and Chinese dynastic legitimacy. It never fully resolved that tension. In good years, success masked it. In bad years, failure exposed it. It also relied on hierarchy and distance to preserve Mongol dominance. That helped maintain control. It limited the dynasty's ability to root itself deeply in the society it governed. Add fiscal pressure, environmental distress, corruption, faction, and rebellion, and the system lost elasticity. A more deeply integrated dynasty might have bent. The Yuan broke. Still, a short-lived dynasty can leave deep marks. The Yuan did. Some of its most lasting effects outlived the regime by centuries. Most visibly, the North gained durable centrality. Beijing's later role was not created from nothing by the Ming and Qing. The Yuan had already made the northern capital a true imperial center.
The Yuan also reinforced large-scale territorial rule and provincial governance.
Later dynasties inherited a political geography shaped in part by Mongol-era choices. The dynasty also bound China more visibly into a wider Eurasian system. That did not make China less Chinese. It did change the scale of exchange, contact, and imagination around it. Memory of the Yuan in later Chinese history has always been uneasy. It could be remembered as foreign domination, as moral warning, or as part of a longer imperial continuum. Both views capture part of the truth. The Yuan was a conquest dynasty. It was also a real Chinese dynasty in the sense that it ruled the empire, shaped institutions, and entered the official sequence of dynastic history. That is precisely why the Yuan remains important. It cannot be placed neatly outside Chinese history. It forces us to ask, what counts as a Chinese dynasty in the first place? So how should the Yuan dynasty be judged? Not as a simple age of foreign tyranny, not as a romantic empire of limitless cosmopolitan grandeur. Both are too easy. The Yuan was powerful, creative, and world-connected. It was also coercive, hierarchical, and structurally fragile. Its greatness and its weakness were tied together. It succeeded brilliantly in proving that Mongol rulers could conquer and govern China. It failed to turn that success into a fully durable moral and political order. That is what makes the Yuan more than a short-lived chapter. It was a vast imperial experiment. It asked whether conquest could become legitimacy, whether mobility could become administration, and whether a foreign ruling house could make itself at home in China without ceasing to be what it was. The answer was mixed. The Yuan could command, connect, and transform, but it never fully persuaded enough of the society beneath it that its rule was the natural shape of order. The Mongols ruled China. They changed it. But ruling China turned out to be harder than taking it. And that is why the Yuan still matters. Before the Yuan became a dynasty, it was a question. Could a conquest empire become a governing empire? This video begins with that problem, because everything else grows from it. The Mongols were masters of expansion. The Yuan would test whether they could also become masters of endurance. That difference between expansion and endurance is the heart of the story. On the steppe, politics moved with the horse. Authority had to be mobile, adaptable, and ready for sudden violence. This produced extraordinary military energy. It did not automatically produce tax offices, provincial files, and grain administration. The farther the Mongols moved into settled worlds, the more they had to govern what they had broken open. China was the greatest test of that transformation. Kublai's political genius was not that he stopped being Mongol. It was that he understood Mongol power needed a Chinese frame. He built with selection, not surrender. He took what would strengthen rule and refused what would dissolve conquest privilege. That selective borrowing made the Yuan formidable. It also made the dynasty incomplete by design. In the short run, incompleteness could be managed. In the long run, it became a vulnerability. The conquest of southern Song demanded patience as well as force. Southern China could not be taken by cavalry logic alone. River warfare, supply coordination, and siege work mattered as much as battlefield shock. The fall of Song, therefore, was not only a triumph of nomad ferocity, it was a triumph of adaptation. That lesson would matter later. A dynasty built by adaptation could still fail if it stopped adapting where legitimacy was concerned. Dadu was planned power. Its walls, avenues, and palace compounds translated dynastic ambition into urban space. Capitals do not merely house governments. They teach subjects where authority lives. By fixing imperial weight in the north, the Yuan changed Chinese political geography beyond its own lifetime. That is one reason the dynasty matters even in defeat. We should not imagine the Yuan state as purely improvised. It could collect, register, route, and command across very great distances. Its weakness lay less in an absence of mechanisms than in the narrower political trust beneath them. That distinction is easy to miss. A regime can look highly organized and still remain politically vulnerable. Administrative efficiency and dynastic durability are not the same thing. Ethnic hierarchy in the Yuan was not random prejudice at the margins. It was woven into the political logic of conquest rule. Conquerors often fear absorption. Hierarchy becomes one way to prevent it. But what preserves the rulers can estrange the ruled. The price of protected identity can be limited belonging. That price grew heavier over time. The examinations had long linked educated ambition to imperial service. Suspending them did more than alter recruitment. It interrupted a political relationship. For many literati, the state no longer looked like the natural destination of learning. It looked selective, guarded, and partly closed. The 1315 restoration helped, but late repair could not erase early distrust. Institutions restored late may work again. They do not always heal memory. Provincial administration under the Yuan was one of its most consequential structural features. It helped an enormous realm become more governable. Later dynasties would inherit a world in which regional governance, on a large scale, felt more normal. That is part of the Yuan paradox. A dynasty can fail and still transform the way empire works. Institutional influence can outlive political success. The relay network was an imperial nervous system. Messages, people, and orders moved through it with strategic speed. Such systems create the feeling of presence. Even distant places can sense the center when information arrives quickly. But every nervous system can become a burden if the body grows weak. Capacity is expensive to maintain. Grain is one of the quiet foundations of empire. Most political history hides that fact behind names and battles. The Yuan could sit in the north because southern productivity could be moved. Geography had to be solved administratively. That solution worked impressively. It also tied the dynasty's stability to systems that could be disrupted by corruption, disorder, or disaster. Logistics, once again, were strength and weakness at the same time. Paper currency gave the Yuan reach. It also demanded confidence in the state behind the paper. When confidence is healthy, paper can feel like power. When confidence erodes, it can feel like doubt made visible. Monetary policy alone did not destroy the dynasty. It became dangerous when added to broader political strain. Tools are only as stable as the order using them. Under the Mongols, distance across Eurasia did not disappear. It became more traversable for some goods, some people, and some ideas. That change enlarged the world around China. It did not make it simple. Exchange remained costly, selective, and political. Still, the wider frame mattered. The Yuan ruled China as part of a world that felt more interconnected than before. That wider frame was one source of Yuan prestige. To travelers from afar, the Yuan could appear magnificent. Large capitals, active trade, and visible order shaped the image. But empire often looks smoothest to outsiders. Those who live beneath it see more of its seams. This is why spectacle can mislead historians if taken alone. Splendor is evidence. It is not the whole explanation. Court ceremony under the Yuan had to do difficult work. It had to project lawful rule while preserving conquest authority. Ceremony can stabilize hierarchy. It cannot erase the memory of how hierarchy was created. The Yuan never escaped that double meaning. It ruled as a dynasty. It remained marked by conquest. Yuan religious policy reflected imperial pragmatism. The court tolerated and used multiple traditions without requiring a single moral monopoly. That widened the dynasty's working alliances. It also made the state feel less anchored in a single Confucian moral grammar. For some, that openness looked sophisticated. For others, it looked like distance from the old moral center of Chinese dynastic rule. Openness brought reach. It did not automatically bring legitimacy. Some of the most refined cultural work of the age came from people partly estranged from the state. Distance became a source of style. Withdrawal did not mean irrelevance. It changed the tone of artistic and intellectual life. Under the Yuan, elite culture often carried memory, reserve, and moral hesitation within it. Political rupture did not silence culture. It redirected it. Kublai's campaigns beyond China reveal an empire still thinking in expansive Mongol terms. They show appetite, not just administration. Yet maritime and tropical campaigns did not favor the same strengths that had made steppe conquest so devastating. Ambition traveled farther than durable control. Power projected outward can return home as strain. Everyday life under the Yuan contained both order and unevenness. Markets could be busy, while resentment deepened elsewhere. Dynasties often look coherent from the center and fractured from the edge. The Yuan's problem was that the edge began to speak back to the center more forcefully over time. Social silence is never permanent. After Kublai, succession no longer carried the same unquestioned momentum. The dynasty had an emperor's structure, but less of a founder's coherence. Founding charisma is not an institution. If it is not translated into durable norms, it weakens when the founder is gone. The Yuan never entirely solved that translation. What the founder held together, the system did not fully inherit. Faction and corruption weaken states gradually, then suddenly. They corrode confidence before they destroy capacity. By the time crisis appears obvious, the habits of decay are often old. The Yuan reached that stage in the decades before its fall. Decay was not theatrical, it was administrative, political, and cumulative. Hunger changes politics from below. A dynasty can survive argument among elites more easily than repeated failure in the fields. Rural hardship carries rumor, anger, and moral judgment together. Once heaven seems absent, obedience becomes much harder to sustain. Disaster became a political verdict. The red turbans mattered because they turned distress into movement. They gave rebellion symbols, organization, and momentum. Once rebellion starts to spread, the state must prove not only that it can punish, but that it can still govern. The Yuan was losing that second test. Violence alone could no longer restore belief. Zhu Yuanzhang's rise shows what happens when rebellion finds discipline. Insurgency became organization, then command, then replacement. Dynasties rarely fall to chaos alone. They fall when chaos is shaped by a rival center strong enough to inherit order. That is what made the end of the Yuan irreversible. A rival future had appeared. The capture of Dadu in 1368 was dramatic, but the deeper fall had already happened in legitimacy, confidence, and control. Capitals are lost at the end. Dynasties are lost earlier, in the slow erosion that makes the end possible. By the time the Ming entered the capital, the Yuan had already failed to secure the future. Military defeat confirmed a political defeat that had matured over years. So the fall of the Yuan should not be reduced to one villain, one emperor, or one battle. It was the failure of an entire governing arrangement under pressure. A conquest dynasty can live with contradictions while strong. It is in weakness that unresolved contradictions become fatal. The Yuan was never merely unlucky. It was structurally exposed. Crisis revealed what foundation had concealed. Yet failure is not the end of influence. The Yuan left behind institutional habits, political geography, and a northern imperial center that later dynasties would inherit. It also expanded the remembered scale of empire. China under the Yuan had been part of a visibly wider world. These were not small after-effects. They shaped how later rulers thought about territory, center, and scale. The Yuan died. Some of its statecraft did not. Later Chinese memory often struggled to place the Yuan neatly. It was too important to ignore and too foreign to sit comfortably in simple moral categories. That discomfort tells us something real. The Yuan belonged to Chinese history, but it belonged in a way that remained contested. That contest over memory is part of the dynasty's legacy too. History does not only preserve events, it preserves arguments about events. The fairest judgment of the Yuan is analytical, not emotional. The dynasty was not a passing barbarian interruption. It was not a flawless cosmopolitan empire either. It was powerful, transformative, and administratively capable. It was also unequal, coercive, and politically brittle. Its triumphs and its limits came from the same source: the attempt to preserve conquest identity while ruling a Chinese empire at full scale. That is the dynasty's central contradiction. So the Yuan matters because it asks one of history's hardest questions. Can a conquest elite govern a great settled civilization without being remade by it? The Yuan tried to answer yes. In practice, the answer was only partial. It could command, connect, and transform. It could not fully naturalize its own rule. That is why the Yuan should be remembered neither as a footnote nor as a legend, but as a revealing imperial experiment. Look again at the map. The Yuan was immense. Size, however, was the beginning of its problem as much as the proof of its success. Look again at Dadu. The capital remained. It still mattered after the dynasty fell. The dynasty did not. Look again at the court. Prestige was real. The ceremony was real. So was the distance beneath it. Look again at the countryside, the fields, the villages, the grain routes. Empires are tested there more harshly than in their capitals. The Yuan conquered China. It also had to learn China. It had to learn its rhythms, its burdens, and its expectations. It never finished learning it. It built routes. It moved grain. It connected distant regions to a northern center. It made the empire function. It opened roads. It welcomed distance. It turned movement into a source of imperial strength. It widened the world around China. It preserved hierarchy. It withheld trust. It kept difference alive inside the structure of rule. It narrowed its own foundation. It projected magnificence. It generated memory. It left an image of power that traveled far beyond its own lifetime. It also generated resistance. It stood at the center. Then, it fled north. The court withdrew, but the marks of its rule remained, yet its imprint stayed behind. Conquest built the dynasty. It gave the Yuan its opening strength. It gave the dynasty its first momentum. Administration sustained it. It kept power moving through offices, roads, grain, and command. It turned conquest into government. Distance weakened it. Political distance, social distance, and imperial overstretch all mattered. They slowly narrowed the dynasty's room to recover. Crisis exposed it. What had been manageable in strong years became dangerous in weak ones. The structure was tested, and the structure gave way. Legacy outlived it. The dynasty fell, but not all of its changes fell with it. Some of them continued to shape China long afterward. The Mongols did not merely ride into China. They did not simply pass through it. Under the Yuan, they tried to stay there as a dynasty. They succeeded enough to change China. They built enough to matter. They did not succeed enough to become unquestioned within it. That is why the dynasty is still historically alive. It remains part of the argument. It remains part of the explanation. It remains a warning against confusing scale with stability. Great size can impress the eye. It does not guarantee endurance. It remains an example of how administration can strengthen power without fully healing political distance. A state can function impressively and still remain vulnerable beneath the surface. It remains proof that a conquest dynasty can be both transformative and fragile. It can change the world it rules. It can still fail to settle fully inside it. It remains central to the story of Beijing. The northern capital did not lose its meaning when the Yuan fell. In some ways, its later importance began here. It remains central to the story of empire in East Asia. The Yuan changed the scale of rule, the map of power, and the imagination of political space. It remains central to the question of what a Chinese dynasty can be. The Yuan forces that question to stay open. It refuses easy definitions. That is why the Yuan deserves more than a label. It deserves more than a stereotype. It deserves to be studied in full. It deserves explanation. Careful explanation. Historical explanation. It deserves historical judgment. Not myth, not reflex. Judgment grounded in structure, evidence, and consequence. And above all, it deserves to be understood. It deserves to be understood on its own terms, and it deserves to be understood in the history of China as a whole.